Supreme Court in Madrid today started the trial of 12 Catalonian politicians for facilitating the independence referendum in October 2017. It was a unilateral independence declaration, and it was subsequently passed by the separatist parties in the regional Catalonian parliament, which was dismissed as illegal by the government in Madrid. Spain's conservative government at the time removed then the regional Catalonian president Carlos Puigdemont and dissolved the Catalonian parliament, calling for snap elections in December of that year. Some of the Catalonian separatist leaders were arrested. Others, including Puigdemont, fled. In November 2018, Spain's public prosecutor formally charged the former Catalonian vice president with rebellion and demanded a 25-year sentence for him. 5 former Catalonian government ministers all face 16-year sentences each. And the president and the former leader of the 2 main Catalonian grassroots movements, respectively, and the former president of the Catalonian parliament faced 17-year imprisonments, each as promoters and leaders of the rebellion. 7 more people, former politicians and policemen, sentenced for minor offences of up to 4 to 11 years in prison. Now, we've got with us today Aamer Anwar, who is an expert in all these things. He's actually an advocate, a lawyer, who's been involved in many of the highest profile court cases of the last few years. And you know everything about this.
I wouldn't say, I could correct you there, Lewis, I wouldn't say I know everything about this. I'm learning rapidly, learned rapidly since I became the lawyer for Clara Ponsatí, Professor Clara Ponsatí, who had one of the international extradition warrants alongside Carlos Puigdemont. She was Minister for Education and had a warrant issued for her arrest back in March. So since then,
she works in St Andrews University.
She's a professor at St Andrews University. She just before the referendum in October 2017 was asked by Puigdemont to come and be the education minister, which he did for some 2.5 months and partook in the independence referendum. And when you read out the charges, there's a lot more than that when you look at the 56 pages of the indictment that run to various lengths and the ridiculous nature of it, because when you talk about rebellion as one of the charges, the most serious charge, rebellion with violence, the rebellion that they're talking about is people, these politicians, activists organising a rebellion with a ballot box. That must be the first time in modern history that you've seen anywhere people being accused of rebelling with violence because they organise a vote, a referendum. So
how much of this is actually a political trial?
Well, we described it when I began the defence of Clara Ponsatí, our legal team, we described it as a politically motivated prosecution, and then rapidly within the space of a few weeks we started to describe it as a politically motivated persecution. Carlos Puigdemont, the president himself, just a few days ago, described it as an act of judicial revenge.
And he's staying in Belgium now.
He's in Belgium, in Waterloo. In Waterloo, yes, president in exile. He still has, and Clara, but although they withdrew the international extradition warrants back in July,
and that was because really the countries they fled to didn't support the same laws as they do in Spain. The rebellion charge being the one that was...
Well, they did. It was a lot more complex than that. It was on the basis that they did not... Yes, you're correct, and they didn't accept that there was a charge of rebellion stood. In Germany, the case had already been thrown out. In Belgium as well, it had been thrown out. All that was left in relation to Puigdemont was a charge of embezzlement. Judge Urena, who is one of the judges that has been pushing this case, decided then not to pursue that charge. With Clara Ponsatí, her extradition warrant was withdrawn. We had already stated publicly that we intended to call President Rajoy, who was the leader of the PPP, along with Santa Maria, who was the Justice Minister, the Deputy Minister, at the time, along with a whole number of other individuals from the Spanish government who had systematically gone against the grain of the idea of presumption of innocence and the idea that these individuals were innocent until proven guilty. and were shown to have, these individuals were shown to have direct links with individuals within the Spanish judiciary. So
let's just pause for a second. Can we just establish, is Clara safe here in Scotland?
Yes, she's safe, but we are keeping a watching brief in that it is expected that the Spanish government or the Spanish judiciary may well pursue an international extradition warrant once these trials are completed.
I see.
These trials have been described, I mean, I'm just back from Barcelona last night, but these trials are being described not just in Catalonia, but throughout Europe today as show trials. It's interesting to note that the Spanish government, that Pedro Sanchez is working his way around Europe. He's going to Strasbourg. He's claiming that this will be a fair trial, that Spain upholds the principles of justice. But only weeks ago, there was a case of the European Convention of Human Rights where a Basque individual was sentenced to prison. And after 5 years of fighting through the appeal process and then going to the European Court, it was shown that Spain had not conducted a fair trial. And the whole concept of a fair trial are not present in this trial.
So there's really been hardly any change since Rajoy was replaced by Sanchez.
No,
is this because Sanchez doesn't have a majority government in Spain?
I don't think it's that. Sanchez describes himself as a socialist, but as I've said repeatedly on a monthly basis in my return to Barcelona, is that I described just on Saturday night in one of their programs Sanchez as being a wolf in sheep's clothing. Because everybody assumed in this country that when Sanchez came to power, he was a socialist, that somehow he would be softer on the Catalans. Whether you come from the Conservative Party, the PPP, the far right, the Vox, or the Socialist Party of Pedro Sanchez, when it comes to the Catalan issue, then they are all united. And for them, the basis is the unity of the Spanish state, the structure of which was laid down by General Franco. Yes. And that overrides every other principle that they may have. Hence why Sanchez just 4 days ago said that there would be no negotiation on the question of referendum. There would be no negotiation on the question of self-determination, which is basically a slap in the face for the Catalan government. And that combines with Casado, who's the leader of the PPP now, who said that Sanchez should be tried for high treason, simply for having discussed matters with President Torra, the president of Catalonia. So what you have is a situation where you have the far right, the right, and the left within Spain, who are all united when it comes to Catalonia, as in there is no discussion. They say the Spanish unity, and they talk about a constitution which was underwritten by Franco and those that followed in his footsteps, which basically means when people say, oh, well, they have to go through Spanish law, what they actually mean is the Catalonia can never, ever vote for independence because there is no mechanism within the Spanish constitution as it has been written to allow the right to self-determination, which at the end of the day, United Nations, fundamental human rights, it all overrides the Spanish constitutional law.
The parties that you've just mentioned, the Vox being the furthest to the right,
yes,
are they all of equal mind, or are some a little bit more towards maybe they should be given a bit more, because it was an autonomous state, wasn't it, before Franco came by?
Well, it's been an autonomous state since Franco died, but when you can see is that I think I describe Spain as one of the world's oldest empires, and has a tradition just as bloodthirsty as the British Empire. So they're well versed in the arts, the dark arts. They're well versed in the arts of divide and rule. They're well versed in the fact that autonomy is given and then you allow people to fight amongst themselves, and the tactic of delay and delay and delay. So as soon as, I mean, we should remember this, as people always describe them as separatists. I think the greatest nationalists that I've seen in Spain or Catalonia are actually the Spanish. The Catalans that I have met, the political parties who believe in independence, very much remind me of those independence parties in Scotland, whether it be the SNP or those from the Green Party and others, who actually believe in a sort of a rainbow coalition and, you know, unity of mankind and black and white, and whereas what you see from the other side is actually a right-wing logic being... So there is an autonomy, but I think we should remember is this, that as soon as the mandate was granted to the politicians to vote for independence, and they did, they weren't banned from standing for election because that was part of their manifesto. And the parallel has to be drawn with, for instance, the SNP. You know, with Nicola Sturgeon, stood in the mandate, was voted for, the overwhelming majority in Parliament was for a independence vote to take place. It would be, the equivalent would be if then tomorrow Theresa May or David Cameron at the time had stepped in and sent in 15,000. Nicola had called a vote. David Cameron didn't agree, but she went, well, we've got the mandate, we're going to call one anyway under the Auspices and our autonomy of the Scottish Parliament. And then David Cameron sent in 15,000 troops and paramilitaries to smash the skulls and to batter old, young men, women, regardless of whether they were voting yes or no, but simply because they happened to be Scottish and voting in a ballot box, and then regarding that as a rebellion, regarding that as violence. And then Nicola had to go into exile, and half the cabinet ended up in prison, and the other half ended up in exile across Europe. People would be in uproar. This country would be independent.
How do you think this fits in with it? We seem to be going around the world and having quite 50-50 splits wherever you go. How does this fit in with that kind of hugely divided society that we seem to have created? Now, the Catalonian people seem to me to understand what they want. But do the people in Spain know what they want?
Well, I think the difficulty with countries like Spain is this, and you see it in other parts of the world, that what they do is play the politics of divide and rule, and they play the politics of scapegoating. So let me finish. Right, you asked the question. So let me just finish on that. That Spain has used traditionally, as have the regimes in the past, used the Catalan card when there is deep-rooted problems with poverty, with unemployment, with homelessness, with the lack of industries and redundancies and all these problems that many other countries are seeing, and the rise of the far right. I think what we need to remember is the ghost of Franco. It's almost as though he's still dictating the tune from his grave, in that before he died, he deliberately set up the structure of the Spanish state, which meant that Catalonia, which was we should remember, was the last place in that country to stand up to Franco. They bombed it. He bombed Catalonia with the assistance of Hitler's military and the assistance of Mussolini. You had the president of Barcelona Football Club who was handed over, by the Nazis and, executed by Franco's regime. And that's the background and history. And in the last 30 years, all those issues have never been resolved. The unmarked graves, the individuals who were responsible for the torture and the disappearances, never ever dealt with. Yet almost they try to present the semblance in public of this peaceful transition to democracy and the democracy. But as soon as anybody raises the question of self-determination, then you see the dark arts come into place, and you see whether you're a left-wing party or whether you're a right-wing party, whether you're a trade unionist. In Spain, the vast majority of them simply unite as one and play the card against the Catalans.
So why exactly do the Spanish want to keep Catalonia? Is it the financial things? Is it the economics of the situation? Or is it just bloody-mindedness? Or is it, what is it? Is it a cultural thing? What makes it so special to the rest of Spain?
Why does England want to keep hold of Scotland?
And that's what I thought you might say.
So, at the end of the day, Catalonia gives out more than it gets back. Catalonia has agriculture, it has industries, it has a thriving port, it has one of the best football teams, if not the best football team in the world, and it has its people, it has banking, it has financial institutions, and it's doing remarkably well in comparison to the rest of the Spain. And it keeps coming back to the fact that it's a very convenient card to be played by any political party about the unity of the Spanish state. This sort of Francoist idea that comes about. So when it comes to the Basques, when it comes to the Catalans, their history that is a lot longer than the Spanish state. The Catalan flag existed for several hundred years before the Spanish flag came into being. When you look at Catalan history and the Catalan nation, it existed for a lot longer than the Spanish nation ever existed. The Catalan language, all these issues. But there's been a deliberate attempt to crush this, a deliberate attempt to wipe out that course of history, a deliberate attempt. If you can't buy them off, then you use weapons, you use violence. But it's peaks and troughs. And this time round, of course, the attempts to use, backroom deals, the attempts to sort of silence the Catalan people didn't work, so they had to show brute force to say, remember who's in charge. Remember the ghost of Franco, remember what we can do to you, and remember where, I know from having spoken to many people who are older generation, who remember family members who were taken, who were shot by Franco's regime, who were tortured, people who disappeared, people who lost their jobs, many of whom were frightened in the past. But what was really optimistic about, and many people are optimistic, many of those old people say, enough. No tingue por is the words that they use, which means we are no longer scared.
So, as in relation to what we're going through here in Scotland with the upsurge of an independence movement again to try and push more from 2014 and to become, Nicola Sturgeon said that she thought that we would be independent in Scotland within 5 years. Now, what lessons can we learn from what has happened in Catalonia here in it? Because I do hear, and I've seen, and I've read people calling for UDI and heaven knows what. What's your take on that, and what would your advice be to those who are pushing hard for independence now?
I think there are parallels between ourselves and Catalonia, but there are also stark differences. We are lucky in this country, and I sometimes despair when I see people say, oh, what's happened to the Catalan people is exactly what has happened to the Scottish people. We're lucky. We didn't have General Franco, right? We haven't had a history well over 30 years where people's family members have disappeared and they can remember what it meant to be tortured, to be executed, to disappear, to have, you know, the dirty tricks of the army and the police to be used against your people, to have have your language banned, not to speak. So all those issues still exist in Catalonia, and they're within a living memory. And obviously now they don't even have to be a memory, because it's a living memory, because you only have to look back to October 2017 to say this is the way they treat us. This is the humiliation that they can take our politicians, they can lock them up, they can transfer them to Madrid, then they can transfer them back to Catalonia, they can transfer them to Madrid, and they hold them hostage. They are described as political hostages. So we're lucky we don't have that. However, the parallels I would draw is this, that we should realise that England, Britain, just like Spain, is well versed in the arts of colonialism, is well versed, is a state that has used for generations, for hundreds of years, politics of divide and rule, and that they will lie. They will do whatever they have to do in order to preserve the unity of the state. However, the principle for us is this no different to the principle that people are fighting for in Catalonia, and that is this. At the end of the day, if millions of people in this country want independence, there's no power on earth that can stop them. You cannot imprison 6 million Scots. You cannot imprison over 2 million Catalans. In the end, it's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. And I think that's the argument that will take place.
I suppose we've got to draw to a close, because I think that you have to go and deal with some other folks now.
Yes, off to the BBC.
Just one last thing about, because we started this off obviously with the trial. Do you have much hope for these poor people who might be in prison for 17, 16, 25 years?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't describe them. I met these people, I wouldn't describe them as poor people. They're individuals of great courage and great dignity. They have refused to be silenced. They have spoken out every single day. Some of them have been in prison for over a year now, waiting trial. And they are determined to fight and to expose the Spanish state for what it is. I believe that it's highly unlikely that they will ever see a fair trial. I believe that these individuals will be found guilty. But what I said to them when I went with President Toro to Lodona's prison where they were held, 8 of the prisoners, last November, and they asked me, what do you think? And I said, well, truly, I believe you will be free. I think you'll be free one day, but you'll be free when Catalonia is free and when it's independent. So there has to be a parallel struggle here. If the whole focus is just on the trial, then Spain wins. They have to capture, they have to re-energize, they have to take the spirit of October the 1st, of the Diada, where over 1.5 million people were on the streets, because those people are ready. They want a strategy. They want to see their politicians, who they elected to deliver independence, to actually deliver independence. Otherwise, it just becomes about the trial. And so those two issues are combined. You know, and I think that on one level we are extremely lucky in this country, but there's lessons to be learned. But what I find deeply shameful, however, is that European leaders have been complicit in their silence, with lack of condemnation, not a word uttered about political prisoners on the mainland of Europe, and the only person to have done so, and I can say with pride, was our First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, who this morning spoke out in support of the Catalans, of the Catalan prisoners, and offered her support to President Toro.
Well, thank you very much for giving us your time.
Thank you.
It's very nice to meet you. So that's all the news we've got time for today. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.